You see here flags at half-staff in honor of Senator Lindsey Graham, one of the most prominent Republican lawmakers, passed away last night at the age of 71.
What the FBI found inside Lindsey Graham's mansion raised more questions than answers. But as the investigation unfolded, the story stretched far beyond a single property. It led to years of political reversals, ethics concerns, controversial remarks, and contradictions that followed Graham throughout his career. For years, he cultivated the image of a loyal conservative, foreign policy hawk, and defender of family values. Yet his public record often painted a far more complicated picture, leaving behind lingering questions that continue to fuel debate today. Who was Lindsey Graham when the cameras were rolling? If you only knew Lindsey Graham from television, you'd probably think you had him figured out. He was the senator reporters called the moment a new international crisis broke out. A man who built one of the most extensive overseas travel records in the entire chamber, touring conflict zones and sitting across from world leaders like it was routine. He was the voice Republican voters trusted on national security, the one who could go on Sunday morning television and make an entire war sound like it made sense. That reputation was not built overnight. Graham first arrived in Washington in 1995 as a member of the House of Representatives, a small-town South Carolina lawyer who worked his way onto the national stage during the impeachment battles of the late 90s. In 2002, he moved up to the Senate, winning the seat vacated by the retiring Strom Thurmond, a seat that came with enormous shoes to fill, and an entire state watching to see if he could fill them. He spent the next 2 decades doing exactly that, carving out a role on the Judiciary Committee where he helped shape the makeup of the federal bench, and eventually rising to chair the Senate Budget Committee, one of the more powerful posts in the chamber. Along the way, he built alliances that reinforced the image even further. For years, he was part of what colleagues nicknamed the Three Amigos, a trio with Senators John McCain and Joe Lieberman built around a shared hawkish worldview, the three of them showing up together in conflict zones and on cable news whenever American foreign policy was in question. That alliance cemented Graham's reputation as one of the Senate's last true believers in the idea that American power had to shape world events before hostile powers did it instead. By the time most Americans had an opinion of Lindsey Graham, that opinion had already been shaped for them. Conservative, hawkish, a defender of tradition, a man who talked about faith, duty, and family as though he had built his entire life around them, someone reporters and rivals alike came to see as one of the most durable political survivors of his generation. Few politicians managed to stay relevant across as many eras of American politics as Graham did. He came up through South Carolina politics in the 90s, built a national profile during the impeachment battles that followed, and remained a fixture in the Senate and on cable news through multiple presidencies, multiple wars, and multiple complete realignments of his own party. That kind of longevity does not happen by accident. It happens through careful positioning, sharp instincts, and, according to his critics, an unusual willingness to say whatever kept him in the room where the decisions actually got made. That was the public Lindsey Graham. But the more time went on, the more it became clear that version was only ever half the picture. Why did his private life become such a mystery? One detail about Graham's life kept resurfacing year after year, campaign after campaign. For a politician who built his entire brand around traditional family values, someone who voted against same-sex marriage and spoke often about the nuclear family as the backbone of the country, his own private life remained almost completely closed off. He never married. He had no children. And unlike almost every other part of his public record, this was one subject Graham simply never explained. the silence created a vacuum. Into that vacuum came years of tabloid stories, internet gossip, and recurring speculation about Graham's private life, including allegations that he was secretly gay while publicly opposing same-sex marriage. None of those allegations were ever proven, and Graham consistently kept his personal life out of the public eye. Even so, the rumors refused to disappear, becoming part of the broader debate over the gap between his public image and his private life. It wasn't that Graham had no family story at all. By his own campaign biography, his parents died while he was still in school, and Graham stepped in to raise his younger sister himself, eventually adopting her legally so she would have a stable home. It was, by any measure, an act of real personal sacrifice, and it complicates the picture rather than simplifying it. Here was a man capable of profound devotion to family in one very specific, very private sense, who nonetheless spent his career publicly holding up a version of family he never built for himself in any conventional way. That contradiction didn't make the story go away. It made people pay closer attention. Profile after profile noted his single status. Voters noticed it. Reporters occasionally asked about it and got little in return. And because Graham offered almost nothing to fill the space, speculation moved in instead, following him quietly through every campaign for the rest of his career, whispering about far more than it was ever discussed openly. To be fair, there is nothing inherently newsworthy about a person choosing not to marry. Plenty of people make that choice for reasons that are entirely their own business, and it says nothing definitive about who they are. But when a politician builds his entire public identity around a version of family he never lived by himself, while privately raising his own sister largely out of the spotlight, the gap between the story he told and the story he lived becomes almost impossible to ignore. And silence, in politics, rarely stays neutral for long. When a public figure declines to explain something as basic as his own personal life, the public tends to write the missing chapters itself. He was asked about it occasionally over the decades. He rarely gave more than a brief, practiced answer before steering the conversation elsewhere, a pattern consistent enough that even reporters who covered him closely came to expect it. That was simply the beginning of a much longer list of things about him that never quite added up. Why did people keep feeling there was more to the story? This is the part where the mansion comes back into the picture, one last time. By the time reports started circulating about what may have been found inside his home, Graham's public and private lives had already spent decades sitting at odds with each other. The mansion didn't create the mystery. It just gave it a shape people could finally point to, a physical space that seemed to stand in for everything about the man that had never been fully explained. And once people started looking behind those walls, even hypothetically, they didn't stop there. They kept going, back through his record, his votes, his statements, his reversals, looking for anything that might explain the distance between the man on television and whatever was actually going on behind the scenes. It became less about one house and more about an entire life that had been curated so carefully for so long that even close observers of Washington politics admitted they weren't entirely sure who Lindsey Graham really was underneath it. What they found wasn't a single hidden secret. It was something more unsettling, a pattern. When did the public image begin to crack? The first crack showed up not in his personal life, but in his own backyard. Graham had built his entire national profile on foreign policy, a senator more comfortable discussing troop movements overseas than the price of groceries back home. But constituents in South Carolina started asking the same question at town halls and in local papers. What about us? Small business owners and working families wanted a senator focused on jobs and the cost of living, not the next overseas flashpoint. Local editorial boards pointed out that his national media appearances increasingly outnumbered his visible engagement on issues at home. The frustration wasn't that Graham ignored his state completely. It was that the imbalance had become impossible not to notice. A senator who could rattle off the details of a defense package overseas faster than he could speak to the economic pressures facing the people who kept electing him. That imbalance followed him literally to the end. He had just returned from a trip to Kyiv, Ukraine, where he met with President Volodymyr Zelensky only days before his sudden death, a final trip many later saw as proof of exactly where his priorities had always lived. Zelensky himself would later note that it was one of roughly 10 wartime visits Graham had made to the country over the years, a level of personal investment in a foreign conflict that few American senators ever came close to matching for any single issue, foreign or domestic. Piece by piece, the image started cracking. A family man with no family. A hometown senator more consumed with the rest of the world than his own state. Two contradictions that, on their own, might have meant nothing. Together, they started to look like a pattern. The first hints that the man on television and the man behind the votes were not always telling the same story. And that wasn't Lindsey Graham, whose name kept appearing in controversy. That version was still to come. Did power change him, or simply reveal him? In 2016, Lindsey Graham was not just skeptical of Donald Trump. He was one of his loudest critics inside the Republican Party, warning voters in blunt, personal terms that nominating him would be a disaster for the country, positioning himself as one of the last principled holdouts against what he called a hostile takeover of his own party. For a brief moment, Graham was one of the Republicans other Republicans pointed to as proof that the party still had a conscience willing to say the quiet part out loud. Then, within a matter of years, that same man became one of Trump's most loyal defenders in the entire Senate. Golf outings, public praise, fierce defenses on cable news the moment Trump faced controversy. By the time Trump returned to office, Graham had become one of his most reliable allies on foreign policy, advising him on matters from Ukraine to Iran, and standing firmly behind military strikes that Graham argued were necessary to keep nuclear weapons out of hostile hands. The reversal was so complete that longtime Washington observers struggled to reconcile the two men as the same person, and reporters who had once quoted his blistering criticism of Trump now quoted him defending the very things he used to condemn. Supporters called it evolution, a decision to work inside the party rather than fight it from the outside, arguing Graham simply recognized where the political ground was shifting and adapted rather than making himself irrelevant. Critics called it something colder, proof that his convictions moved with whatever kept him closest to power, evidence that the loud, principled stand of 2016 had never really been about principle at all. Which raises the real question. Did power change Lindsey Graham? Or did it simply reveal something that had been there all along? A man who understood exactly how far he was willing to bend to stay in the room where decisions got made? It was a question that would only grow louder as more of his record came into view. What legacy did he really leave behind? By his final years, the cracks were no longer subtle. The Senate Ethics Committee issued Graham a formal letter of admonition after he was found to have solicited campaign contributions from inside a federal building, a rule meant to keep government business separate from political fundraising. It is the kind of finding that exists specifically to prevent the machinery of government from being used, even in small ways, to benefit a politician's own campaign. For most politicians, a formal rebuke like that becomes a permanent stain, replayed for years by opponents. For Graham, it barely registered nationally. Buried under whatever controversy came next in a news cycle, he had an unusual talent for outrunning. A special grand jury in Georgia went much further. Investigating efforts to overturn the 2020 election results, the jury spent months gathering testimony and evidence before ultimately recommending that charges be considered against a group of Trump allies. And Graham's name was on that list, tied to phone calls he made to Georgia election officials in the aftermath of the vote. Investigators viewed those calls as part of a broader pattern of pressure applied to state officials across multiple contested states. Graham was never charged, and he defended the calls firmly as legitimate legislative oversight, nothing more than a senator doing his due diligence on how elections are run. But the fact remains that a legally convened grand jury looked at the conduct of a sitting United States senator and found it serious enough to flag for prosecutors, which is a very different thing from ordinary political criticism. Then came the moment that alarmed people far beyond Capitol Hill. Amid rising tensions between Russia and Ukraine, Graham said on camera that someone inside Russia needed to, in his words, take Vladimir Putin out. An unmistakable public call for the assassination of a foreign head of state, delivered not in private, but for the entire world to hear. Foreign policy analysts called it reckless, warning it could complicate already fragile diplomatic channels and hand Russian state media a ready-made talking point. Even some of Graham's own Senate colleagues quietly distanced themselves from language that stark. By the end, even his own party seemed to be pulling away. At a Trump rally in South Carolina, he was booed openly by the very base he had spent decades courting, a rare and uncomfortable moment for a sitting senator at what was supposed to be a friendly event. At the same time, he was fighting off a serious primary challenge from Paul Dans, the strategist behind Project 2025, who built an entire campaign around painting Graham as an out-of-touch establishment figure who said whatever kept him relevant in Washington rather than delivering results back home. Graham ultimately defeated Dans and other challengers in the June primary to secure his party's nomination for a fifth term, but the challenge itself and the discontent behind it never fully disappeared. He was still looking ahead to that fall election, reportedly telling colleagues he expected to chair the Judiciary Committee if re-elected, when his life ended suddenly instead. And yet, even here, the picture refused to stay simple. For all the partisan fire, Graham maintained genuine friendships across the aisle that surprised people who only knew him from cable news. He spent months working alongside Senator Dick Durbin, a Democrat, on immigration reform, the two of them setting aside deep disagreements to try to pass something real. Durbin would later describe him as a fierce partisan who was also, somehow, a trustworthy friend, someone who never surprised him and always kept his word in private, even when they were tearing into each other in public. It was one more piece of the puzzle that didn't fit neatly anywhere. A man capable of real loyalty and real principle in his personal dealings, operating inside a public career defined, again and again, by reversal and controversy, a hidden personal life, a senator more focused on the world than his own state, a political reversal that stunned Washington, an ethics rebuke, a grand jury recommendation, a comment about assassinating a foreign leader, voters booing the man they once elected, and a primary fight that never got the chance to reach its conclusion. None of it alone defines a legacy. Together, it starts to look like a portrait of a man who spent his entire career deciding exactly how much of himself the public was allowed to see, and who left office and this earth before anyone got to see the rest. So which version of Lindsey Graham was real? The conservative icon who commanded Sunday morning television? The private man who quietly raised his own sister, but never let anyone all the way into the rest of his life? The partisan warrior who could also be a genuinely loyal friend to people on the other side of the aisle? Or the senator whose own record, the ethics letter, the grand jury recommendation, the reversal on Trump, the comment about Putin, kept contradicting the image he spent 30 years building? Maybe the honest answer is that he was all of them at once, and that the real mystery was never which version was the mask. It was that Lindsey Graham never let the country see enough of him to know for certain where the mask ended and the man began. He died with a primary challenge unresolved, with boos from his own party still ringing, and with a private life he took to his grave without ever fully explaining it. Whatever was or wasn't behind the walls of that mansion, it was never really about the house. It was about how much of the man inside it the world was ever actually shown, and how comfortable he seemed keeping it that way right up until the very end. What do you think his legacy should be? The image he built, or the questions he never answered? Drop your take in the comments, and if you want more deep dives into the public figures who were never quite who they claimed to be, hit subscribe so you never miss one.